Let's talk about Louisville, Kentucky. Stick around. EG family, welcome back. It's Robert, your everyday gentleman, and today I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk to you guys about a trip that my wife and I took earlier this year to bourbon country, Louisville, Kentucky, or as I was corrected on the airplane on the way over there, Louisville, by the passenger sitting next to me. She was awesome, by the way. But yeah, my wife and I decided to take a trip out to Louisville, Kentucky to, both of us are whiskey aficionados, whiskey drinkers, and so what better place to go than to, the place where bourbon, it has just a ton of distilleries. Now, obviously, Kentucky is not the only place where you can find bourbon or the only place that bourbon is made. Bourbon is dependent on a few different things as far as, the mash bill, how it's barreled and things of that nature. I won't get into it today, but there are a ton of bourbon distilleries in Louisville, Kentucky, and so that's why we decided on that place. I'm gonna get into a little bit about how our trip was, what we did and those things, but before we get into it, if this is your first time here, I want to welcome you. If you're into not only things like whiskey, but also men's style, fragrances, grooming, fitness, cigars, pipe tobacco, and other topics for the everyday man, then this might be the place for you. Consider subscribing and joining the growing EG family. And if you're already a member, I want to thank you for your continued support. And without further delay, let's start talking about bourbon country. All right, so as you saw in the intro, I poured myself a little drink so I can sit down and, kind of go over this trip with you guys. This particular bottle that I poured, though, is from Kentucky. I went there with the goal of coming back with something that would be difficult to get pretty much anywhere else. I wasn't really looking at anything allocated or anything like that. Mainly something that, would be more exclusive to getting in Kentucky. Now, this particular bottle, it's a bottle of Rebel Cask Strength, is from a place out there that some of you may be familiar with. I actually found out about it on the trip, but it's a place called Justin's House of Bourbon. This place was recommended to us by one of the clerks at a shop that my wife and I were going to as we were, walking around downtown area. But that is one of the places that we really enjoyed visiting on our trip out there. Now, my wife and I went, it was a shorter trip. It was about 4 days that we spent out there, 3 nights. We stayed in the downtown area, kind of wanted to be in the heart of everything. Now, last year, my wife and I took a trip to Nashville, Tennessee, which was awesome. And we kind of thought this might be a little bit more mellow, which it definitely was. Now, we were right by the 4th Street Live area, which was supposed to be pretty lively from what I understood, but maybe it was due to the pandemic or anything like that. But there was stuff going on, but it really wasn't a whole lot going on. There wasn't a whole lot going on throughout the city. Now, it was on the cooler side, so maybe that had something to do with it. But all in all, we did find things to do in the evening, as far as hanging out at bars and things like that. So now the highlight of the trip was actually visiting, obviously, distilleries. That's really what my wife and I were going for. So the first full day that we were there, we set up a tour to 3 different distilleries. We visited Preservation, we visited Four Roses, and we visited Stitzel-Weller. The Four Roses distillery that we went to actually wasn't a distillery at all. It was more of a warehouse and bottling distribution center. We weren't able to book a tour of the distillery itself, but we still got to enjoy a tasting and those things. But we started with visiting Preservation Distillery. We saw the distillery itself where they distill the whiskey. We saw where they separate the whiskey from the tops, the mids, and the bottoms, and learning facts and things along the way as far as the different types of charring that go inside the barrels and things of that nature. And then after we were done with visiting the distillery itself, we went over and sat down and tried a few different offerings from Preservation. Some I wasn't too familiar with, but I am familiar with the very own St. Nick offering that they have. I'd never tried it, so I was looking forward, and that's obviously the reason why we took this trip, to try different whiskeys that we hadn't really tried before. When it comes to tasting, I'm not one that's going to really pinpoint specific notes and things like that. I've mentioned this to you guys before, but I can tell if something's sweet, something's smoky, something's woody, spicy, You know, different things like that. And sometimes I can get a little specific with the tasting notes that I get, but for the most part, you know, it's those general ideas of what you get. But either way, it's still cool to hear what other people are tasting and then kind of get that vibe as well when I'm tasting it myself. So that's the cool thing about going to these tastings. Now in Kentucky, there's numerous distilleries. I mean, there's a ton. I don't even know exactly how many there are. Let me look it up and find out actually. Let's see. 95 throughout Kentucky. Now that's obviously not gonna be, you know, around Louisville or the general area. In fact, there's only a few in Louisville itself. You have to travel a ways from there to get to some of the distilleries that we were visiting. But there's numerous options for you to visit, and obviously, you know, it's difficult to get them all knocked out. We only got 3 in a day. I think tours typically will do 4, maybe 5, but obviously when there's 95 throughout the state, it's going to be difficult to get them all done. But they do have this thing in Kentucky, which, you know, my wife and I have talked about going back to do, which is called the Bourbon Trail, where you set up a few days and you visit a lot more distilleries within that time, following the Bourbon Trail. Now, after we were done with the tasting at Preservation, their shop is adjacent to it. You can buy some bottles if you want to take some bottles home. My wife did end up picking a bottle of the bourbon that she liked there. And you know, there's memorabilia and things of that nature you can take with you. And then we wrapped up that distillery and we moved on to the next one. Now, the next one that we visited was, again, not a distillery itself, more of a distributor and bottling, which was the Four Roses. Now here we did primarily a tasting, and but we did get to see one of the rick houses. Now, one of the things that I started realizing is around, you know, Kentucky in general, and especially around the distilleries, is you'll notice a lot of black trees and a lot of the buildings are black. The reason for that, I found, is because of the whiskey vapor. The whiskey vapor is just so prominent in the air that a mold or a fungus will start to grow on the surfaces of the trees and the buildings, which is called whiskey fungus, or different names for it. But that's a pretty cool you know, fact that I hadn't known before, that you'll get that fungus growing out there. It's pretty common. From what I understand, it's pretty harmless to be around it unless you have some kind of allergy or anything like that. But for the most part, you should be fine. You know, and we also got to see the rick houses themselves. We got to go inside one of the rick houses at Four Roses, see the barrels, understand how the placement of the barrel itself might be impacted by the weather, the location, the temperature, the sunlight, and how obviously that's going to impact the flavor. Now, after we were done with Four Roses, we got to go out to our final one for the day, and this was to Stitzel-Weller, which I wasn't too familiar with, but got to learn that it's actually a pretty well-known distillery out there. One of the original ones, from what I understand. When we got there, we learned that you know, things like Pappy Van Winkle, and there's a lot of history at this particular distillery. So going into it, I wasn't, you know, I was looking forward to it, but after learning all of the history that was going on at this particular distillery, I mean, I was really excited. This actually ended up being my favorite one of the 3 that we visited. And my wife and I actually have a tradition of every year we add a special ornament for our Christmas tree, depending on what we did for the year. Last year we got something from Mammoth. It was our first time at Mammoth. We love snowboarding. This year we got something from Kentucky, and I ended up getting a 5 keys ornament from Stitzel-Weller. The 5 keys, we learned, is a symbol for the 5 keys to making an excellent bourbon. But similar to the other tours that we did, you know, we got to learn about the history of Stitzel-Weller. We got to see the process. We got to see where they do the blending. You know, some of the rick houses we got to go inside of as well. We got to see the barrel repair shop. Just really cool, getting a good understanding of what goes on inside of a distillery. And then obviously after that, we got into the tasting. Again, trying different whiskeys, getting a feel for what things taste like. I will say that all of the hosts, all of the tour guides at these distilleries were awesome. Our particular tour guide that was driving us from one place to the other was awesome as well. And all in all, it was just a great trip. So if you ever thought about getting out to Louisville, Kentucky, I highly recommend it. Definitely get out and visit some of the distilleries. Now, after we were done with the tours, my wife and I got home, and we decided to go out for the night. And we went out to 4th Street, which we thought would be a little more lively. It really wasn't. You know, after going to Nashville last year, we thought it would maybe be along those vibes, but all in all, downtown area was pretty mellow. There were a couple things going on. There was a country bar, you know, just walking distance away from where we are there at 4th Street. And so we visited that. We hung out there for a little while. Now the following day, we set up actually a tour at the Louisville Slugger Museum. My wife is she's a big time Dodgers fan, very big into baseball. She likes football as well. I'm more of a football guy, but she wanted to check this place out, and obviously, you know, we had to keep the wife happy. Happy wife, happy life. So we set up a tour at the Louisville Slugger Museum. Now we walked over, we weren't too far from it, so we decided to, you know, get a feel for the downtown area and walk over to it. And it's pretty cool because kind of like how in Hollywood you have Sunset Boulevard where you have the Walk of Fame and you have the stars on the ground. They have something similar, but for baseball. As you're walking, you'll see these bats with a plaque on the ground, and it'll be dedicated to a particular baseball player. So it's pretty cool to see that. My wife is, again, more of a baseball person than I am, so she was, you know, enjoying seeing the plaques and reading about the players and looking, obviously, for her beloved Dodgers. Now the factory itself is pretty cool, you know, as far as getting to see how the bats are made, seeing where actual baseball players are going and picking out the particular types of wood that they want. Different woods will perform different ways. We saw the area where particular players will store the wood stock that's used for their bats. Again, my wife, as a huge Dodgers fan, was enjoying seeing her Dodgers players out there and looking at the bats that they'll eventually be using on the field. They have a cool shop there too with a bunch of baseball memorabilia. You can get a bat personalized, so that's a pretty cool thing to see as well when you're out in Louisville, Kentucky. And then after we were done with the Louisville Slugger Museum, obviously it's Kentucky, we visited another distillery. First we had lunch, and then after that we visited the Old Forester distillery and set up another tasting there. Now we weren't able to do a tour, but we did get to visit their gift shop and then do a tasting. My wife actually ended up finding one of her favorite whiskeys there now, or at least her current favorite, which is the Old Forester 1920. And you know, that's the really cool thing about visiting these distilleries and doing these tastings, is that you never know, you might find something that just becomes your favorite drink, or something that you know is your favorite reach moving forward. I also mentioned earlier that we visited Justin's House of Bourbon. This place was awesome. I mean, looking at some of the old bottles that are in there, some from Prohibition and prior to, I mean, there's just a lot of history in there. And obviously you can do tastings there as well. You can get some pretty cool stuff that's a little bit harder to find. But for the most part, most of the stuff that I saw in there was pretty common stuff that you can find. But they do have some of their barrel selects. You can try out different things. And again, ended up taking a bottle home with me. So Justin's is definitely a place I would recommend if you ever get a chance to go out to Louisville. Now, all in all, it was a blast going out to Louisville. It wasn't something that I would say is, if you're looking to party, you know, something like a Vegas trip, or obviously Nashville. If you've ever been to Nashville, you get out to Broadway, you know, it's a party town. Louisville's not like that. You do have places you can go out and have a little bit of fun, but at least when we went, it wasn't as lively as some of those areas. But there are things to do, you know, it's not boring by any means, but it is a little more mellow of a place than those places I mentioned. Still a lot of fun. If you're into whiskey, if you're into baseball, there's definitely a lot to do, but it's gonna be more of a mellow trip and just kind of sightseeing and obviously visiting those distilleries. So it's definitely something that we enjoyed, and it's something that we would definitely look to do again, because we still got a lot more distilleries to visit. But let me know down below in the comments if you've ever been out to Louisville. What are some of the distilleries you enjoyed visiting? What are some of maybe the hole in the wall or bars that you might recommend for the next time we go? And yeah, any recommendations that you can give, I'd love to hear those. Now, if you made it this far and you enjoyed the video, make sure you let me and YouTube know by hitting the like button. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and do all the things that help this channel continue to grow. And remember, being a gentleman is an everyday thing. Now it's time to kick back, finish this rebel. Cheers, fam.